She has not taken a single step in 20 years, the surgeon said, shaking his head. If there were a solution, someone would have found it by now. The woman in the wheelchair did not argue. After hearing the same sentence from dozens of specialists across 2 decades, disappointment no longer arrived as a shock. It arrived like weather. Predictable, quiet, heavy. Across the hospital waiting room in Wichita, Kansas, Ethan Walker sat with a worn backpack resting beside his boots. He was not there for himself. He was there because his 12-year-old son, Caleb, needed a follow-up appointment after a sports injury. Ethan glanced toward the woman only briefly before returning to a stack of paperwork and insurance forms. He had learned long ago that everyone carried burdens invisible to strangers. Outside the hospital windows, cold rain streaked across the parking lot. A faded pickup truck sat beneath a flickering light pole, waiting for another long drive home. The surgeon gathered his notes and walked away. The woman remained motionless, not physically, emotionally, the kind of stillness that comes from carrying hope for too many years. Several people recognized her immediately. Whispers traveled through the waiting room. Everyone knew who Charlotte Bennett was. Billionaire, one of the most successful business leaders in America. Yet success could not buy what she wanted most. She stared at the floor while conversations quietly resumed around her. Ethan noticed something then. A folder had slipped from her lap. Medical records scattered across the polished floor. Several people saw it happen. Nobody moved. Some were intimidated. Others simply looked away. Ethan stood without hesitation. He knelt carefully, gathered the papers, organized them by page number, and handed them back. "Looks like these tried to escape," he said with a small smile. Charlotte accepted them. "Thank you." Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years pretending she was stronger than she felt. Ethan nodded politely. Nothing more. No recognition. No questions. No mention of who she was. When a nurse called Caleb's name, Ethan simply walked away. Charlotte watched him disappear down the hallway. It was a strange feeling. Most people saw her fortune before they saw her humanity. That man had done the opposite. An hour later, Ethan and Caleb stopped at a grocery store on the edge of town. The refrigerator at home was nearly empty, and payday was still 3 days away. Ethan studied prices carefully while Caleb compared cereal boxes. Life was a constant exercise in responsibility. Utility bills, school expenses, gas for the truck. There was never enough money, but somehow they always managed. As they loaded groceries into the pickup truck, rain continued falling steadily. Caleb climbed into the passenger seat. "Dad, yeah." That lady at the hospital looked sad. Ethan started the engine. Sometimes people carry things nobody else can fix. Caleb stared through the windshield. "Do you think she will be okay?" Ethan considered the question. "I hope so." The answer stayed with him all evening. Later, after dinner, he sat at the kitchen table reviewing bills while Caleb worked on homework nearby. The house was small, modest, comfortable in the way homes become when love compensates for what money cannot provide. A church parking lot across the street glowed beneath streetlights as volunteers prepared food boxes for families in need. Ethan folded another overdue bill and rubbed his tired eyes. Then his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. He almost ignored it. Almost. When he answered, a calm female voice spoke on the other end. "Mr. Walker, my name is Charlotte Bennett." Ethan sat upright. Across the room, Caleb looked up from his homework. The voice continued. "I know this may sound strange, but there is something about today that I cannot stop thinking about. Would you be willing to meet with me?" Ethan stared at the rain running down the kitchen window. He had no idea why one of the most powerful women in America was calling him. But something in her voice told him this conversation might change both of their lives. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window while Caleb watched from across the table. The voice on the phone remained patient. Not demanding, not entitled, just unexpectedly human. "I know this is unusual," Charlotte Bennett said, "but I would appreciate the chance to thank you properly." Ethan glanced at the stack of utility bills beside him. "You do not owe me anything. I picked up some papers." A quiet laugh came through the line. That is exactly why I am calling. The answer caught him off guard. Across the street, volunteers continued unloading food donations at the church parking lot beneath the glow of floodlights. Finally, Ethan agreed to meet her for coffee the following afternoon. After ending the call, Caleb immediately leaned forward. Was that really her? Ethan nodded. Looks that way. Caleb grinned. A billionaire called our house. Ethan smiled despite himself. Tomorrow morning the trash still needs taking out. The boy laughed. Some things remained wonderfully ordinary. The next afternoon, Ethan drove his aging pickup truck to a small diner on the edge of Wichita. The place smelled of fresh coffee, grilled sandwiches, and decades of conversation. Charlotte had specifically requested somewhere casual. When Ethan arrived, he immediately noticed the wheelchair beside a corner booth. Charlotte was already there. No assistants. No security team hovering nearby. No cameras. Just a woman waiting quietly with a cup of tea. Ethan slid into the seat across from her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for inviting me." For a few moments they talked about ordinary things. Weather. Caleb. The diner itself. It was surprisingly easy. Then Charlotte's expression grew more serious. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Why did you help me yesterday?" Ethan frowned slightly. "Because your papers fell. Most people recognize me." "I did recognize you." Charlotte blinked. "You did?" Ethan smiled. "I just figured being famous did not make those papers any easier to pick up." For the first time all afternoon, genuine laughter escaped her. Not the practiced laugh of a corporate leader. A real one. Yet beneath it remained sadness. Ethan noticed it immediately. Years of raising a son alone had taught him to recognize pain hidden behind smiles. Outside the diner window, cars moved through wet streets while a school bus passed nearby. Finally, Charlotte looked down at her hands. 20 years, she said quietly. 20 years of doctors, specialists, surgeries, therapies, and promises. Ethan listened without interruption. Every few months someone tells me they have a new answer. She shook her head. And every time, nothing changes. The words hung heavily between them. Ethan did not rush to encourage her. He did not offer false hope. Sometimes dignity meant respecting another person's disappointment. "That sounds exhausting," he said softly. Charlotte stared at him. Most people responded with solutions. Motivational speeches. Advice. Ethan offered understanding. Somehow it felt more valuable. Then she revealed something unexpected. 3 weeks ago, I stopped going to physical therapy. Ethan raised an eyebrow. After 20 years, she nodded. I was tired of trying. The confession seemed to cost her something. Admitting surrender often does. A waitress refilled their drinks and walked away. Ethan looked through the diner window, toward his pickup truck sitting beneath gray clouds. Then he turned back to Charlotte. "Maybe the hardest thing is not failing," he said. "Maybe the hardest thing is believing another step is worth taking." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly. Not because she disagreed, because something about the sentence landed deeper than she expected. Then she reached in her bag and pulled out a thick folder. Medical records, therapy reports, evaluations collected across 2 decades. She slid them across the table. "You are probably going to think I am crazy." Ethan looked down at the folder. "Why?" Charlotte held his gaze. "Because for the first time in 20 years, I want someone to look at this who is not a doctor." For a moment, Ethan simply stared at the folder resting between them. The diner around them continued as normal. Plates clattered. Coffee poured. A family settled into a nearby booth after a youth basketball game. Yet the request felt strangely significant. "I should probably point out that I'm not a doctor," Ethan said. Charlotte gave a small smile. "That is exactly the point." Ethan looked at the thick stack of records. 20 years of scans, evaluations, specialist reports, therapy notes, and recommendations. Thousands of pages reduced to a single question. Why had nothing worked? "What do you expect me to find?" he asked. Charlotte traced the rim of her teacup. "Maybe nothing." Her eyes drifted toward the rain-streaked window. "But every doctor who looked at those papers started by telling me what was wrong. Yesterday, you were the first person all day who treated me like a person before treating me like a problem." The honesty in her voice caught him off guard. Ethan looked down at the folder again. Finally, he nodded. "I can read them." Relief flashed briefly across her face. Not hope. Not yet. Just relief. They left the diner shortly afterward. Outside, Charlotte's adapted SUV waited near the curb. Ethan climbed into his pickup truck and drove home through wet Kansas streets. The folder sat on the passenger seat the entire way. It looked heavier than paper should. That evening, after dinner, Caleb spread science homework across the kitchen table while Ethan began sorting through the records. Medical terminology filled every page. Surgical histories, physical therapy assessments, specialist consultations from hospitals across the country. At first, nothing stood out, just years of effort and disappointment. The refrigerator hummed quietly nearby. Utility bills remained tucked beneath a magnet. Ordinary life surrounded extraordinary circumstances. Around 9 o'clock, Caleb wandered over carrying a glass of milk. That the lady from the hospital? Ethan nodded. Yep. The boy glanced at the paperwork. That looks miserable. Ethan laughed softly. You're not wrong. Caleb studied a photo clipped to one report. Charlotte appeared younger, sitting in a rehabilitation center years earlier. Do you think she's going to walk again? Ethan paused. I honestly do not know. The answer felt important because it was true. Hope built on honesty lasts longer than hope built on promises. Over the next several days, Ethan continued reading whenever he had spare time. Between work, parenting, grocery runs, and household responsibilities, progress was slow. Yet one thing began to bother him. Not something medical, something practical. Every therapy report emphasized muscle weakness, limited mobility, and reduced balance. Yet none seemed to spend much time discussing the daily environments where Charlotte actually lived. Her home, her office, her routines. The question lingered in his mind. On Friday afternoon, Charlotte called. Any discoveries? Ethan hesitated. Not exactly. A brief silence followed. That bad? She asked. No. Ethan looked out the garage window toward his pickup truck parked beside the driveway. I just think I might be asking a different question than everyone else. Charlotte sounded curious. What question? Ethan leaned back in his chair. What if the problem is not only how you move, he said. What if part of the problem is how your entire life has been built around not moving? Silence filled the line. Not offended silence. Thinking silence. Then Charlotte quietly asked something nobody had asked him before. Would you be willing to come see it for yourself? Ethan frowned. See what? Her answer came immediately. My world. The invitation stayed in Ethan's mind all weekend. Not because Charlotte Bennett was famous. Not because she was wealthy. But because her question felt sincere. On Monday afternoon, after finishing work and picking Caleb up from school, he finally agreed. The following day, he drove his aging pickup truck through the gates of Charlotte's estate on the outskirts of Wichita. The property was impressive without being extravagant. Carefully maintained gardens, wide paved paths, a modern home designed around accessibility. Everything looked efficient, thoughtful, controlled. Yet something about it felt strangely quiet. Charlotte greeted him at the entrance in her wheelchair. Thank you for coming. Ethan nodded. Thanks for having me. She offered a tour herself. No assistants, no executives, no specialists, just the two of them. As they moved through the house, Ethan noticed something unusual. Every room had been adapted. Cabinets lowered. Hallways widened. Technology installed to eliminate obstacles. Every challenge had a solution. Every inconvenience had been removed. Charlotte watched him carefully. What are you thinking? Ethan hesitated. Honestly, she smiled faintly. I invited you here for honesty. Ethan looked around the spacious kitchen. Your entire life has been redesigned so you never have to struggle. Charlotte laughed softly. Most people would call that progress. Maybe. Ethan shrugged. But sometimes struggling is how people discover what they are capable of. The answer lingered between them. Neither argued. Later they sat outside on a covered patio overlooking a small lake. The afternoon sun reflected off the water while a gentle breeze moved through the trees. For the first time, Charlotte spoke openly about the accident. She had been 24 years old, young, ambitious, certain the future would unfold exactly as planned. Then one day, everything changed. Career survived. Her body did not. After a while, she admitted quietly, you stop grieving what happened. You start grieving who you might have become. Ethan listened without interruption. That simple act seemed to comfort her more than advice ever could. Meanwhile, back in town, Caleb waited at a public library after school, finishing homework until Ethan returned. Before leaving Charlotte's home, Ethan checked his watch. I need to pick up my son. Charlotte smiled. You always mention him. Ethan's expression softened. Because he is the best thing in my life. Something changed in Charlotte's eyes. Not envy. Recognition. She had spent 20 years surrounded by specialists, consultants, and executives. Very few people spoke about another human being with that kind of uncomplicated love. As Ethan prepared to leave, he noticed a physical therapy room connected to the house. Treadmills, parallel bars, advanced equipment worth more than his truck. Everything appeared untouched. When was the last time you used this? He asked. Charlotte looked away. 8 months ago. Ethan frowned. You stopped completely? I was tired of failing. The words came out sharper than she intended. Silence followed. Outside, the delivery truck passed the distant mailbox near the entrance gate. Life moved forward whether people were ready or not. Finally, Ethan walked into the therapy room and studied it carefully. Not like a doctor, not like a specialist, like a father who had spent years fixing broken things, because replacing them was not an option. Then he noticed something small, a handwritten notebook sitting beneath a stack of reports. The cover was worn from years of use. Ethan picked it up. What is this? Charlotte's expression changed immediately. Not fear, something closer to vulnerability. That, she said quietly, is the only thing no doctor ever wanted to read. Ethan looked down at the notebook. Somehow he knew that whatever was inside might matter far more than every medical record he had already reviewed. Charlotte stared at the notebook in Ethan's hands as though it contained something far more personal than medical records. The late afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the unused therapy room, casting long shadows across equipment that had not been touched in months. Ethan opened the cover carefully. The first pages were not clinical observations. They were journal entries. Dates, thoughts, frustrations, small victories, private fears. You wrote all this? He asked. Charlotte nodded. Every day, for nearly 15 years. Ethan sat down and began reading. Not every page, just enough to understand the pattern. Doctors had documented muscle strength, balance, mobility, and neurological responses. Charlotte had documented something else entirely. Fear, isolation, exhaustion, shame after setbacks, guilt whenever people rearranged their lives around her limitations. As Ethan turned page after page, a realization slowly emerged. The physical injury had changed her body, but over 20 years, her world had slowly trained her to stop trusting it. On his drive home, the notebook occupied his thoughts. The old pickup truck rattled along a county road, while Kansas fields stretched toward the horizon. He was not thinking about medicine anymore. He was thinking about behavior, habits, adaptation. Every entry in the journal described Charlotte becoming more dependent on systems designed to help her. Helpful systems, necessary systems, but systems nonetheless. By the time he reached home, Caleb was already waiting by the mailbox. How did it go? The boy asked. Ethan smiled faintly. I think I learned something. That evening, after dinner, Ethan spread the notebook beside the medical records on the kitchen table. Utility bills remained tucked beneath a magnet on the refrigerator. Ordinary responsibilities surrounded an increasingly extraordinary question. Caleb sat nearby, working on homework. What did you find? He asked. Ethan leaned back thoughtfully. I think everyone spent 20 years trying to fix her body. And Ethan looked at the notebook. I'm starting to wonder if nobody spent enough time helping her trust it again. The idea sounded almost too simple, which was exactly why he kept returning to it. 3 days later, Charlotte invited him back. This time they met in the therapy room. The expensive equipment stood silent around them. Charlotte looked skeptical when Ethan explained what he had noticed. You think this is psychological? She asked. Ethan immediately shook his head. No, your injury is real. Your limitations are real. I am saying something different. He paused carefully. I think your life became so focused on avoiding failure that you stopped giving yourself permission to struggle. Charlotte crossed her arms. That sounds like something from a motivational speech. Ethan smiled. Then let me explain it another way. He pointed toward a Walker stored in the corner. When was the last time somebody asked you to do something difficult without promising success? The question landed harder than expected. Charlotte opened her mouth to answer. Nothing came out, because she could not remember. Doctors promised outcomes. Therapists measure results. Consultants managed expectations. Nobody simply asked her to try. For the first time in years, she looked uncertain rather than defeated. It was a subtle but important difference. Then Ethan made a request. Not a treatment, not a diagnosis. A request. I want you to come with me tomorrow morning. Charlotte frowned. Where? A community rehabilitation center on the south side of town. Why? Ethan's expression remained calm. Because there are people that are fighting battles every day without knowing whether they will win. Charlotte stared at him. And what exactly am I supposed to do? Ethan looked toward the unused equipment surrounding them. Then back at her. I want you to stop being the patient for one day. A long silence followed. Finally, for the first time in months, curiosity appeared where hopelessness had lived. And neither of them yet realized that the next morning would change the direction of everything. The next morning, Charlotte almost canceled twice before leaving her house. 20 years of appointments had taught her to expect disappointment. Hope felt far more dangerous. Yet shortly after 9 o'clock, she followed Ethan's pickup truck across Wichita to a modest community rehabilitation center tucked between a public library and a small church parking lot. The building was older than the facilities she normally visited. The equipment was simpler. The waiting room furniture showed signs of years of use. But the place carried something her luxury therapy suites had slowly lost. Life. Inside, people of every age worked through challenges. A retired teacher relearning balance after surgery. A teenage athlete recovering from an injury. A veteran rebuilding strength after a long illness. Nobody was focused on perfection. They were focused on progress. Charlotte noticed it immediately. Ethan held the door open for an elderly man using a walker before joining her in the therapy room. Why are we here? She asked quietly. Ethan smiled. Because I wanted you to meet people who do not spend all day thinking about what they lost. The comment was not criticism. It was observation. Charlotte wheeled forward and spent the next hour simply talking with people. Listening. Encouraging. Sharing stories. At first she felt awkward. Then something unexpected happened. She stopped thinking about herself. A young woman recovering from a serious injury recognized Charlotte from television. You built one of the biggest companies in the country, she said. How did you keep going? Charlotte opened her mouth to answer, then paused. The honest answer surprised even her. Some days I did not. The room grew quiet. Yet instead of judgment, she received understanding. For years she had been surrounded by people impressed by her accomplishments. These people connected to her honesty. By lunchtime, something had shifted. Outside, Ethan and Charlotte sat on a bench while a food truck served sandwiches to staff and patients. Autumn sunlight warmed the parking lot. Charlotte watched a group of patients celebrating small milestones. One extra step, one extra minute, one extra attempt. Victories most people never noticed. I forgot what trying looked like, she admitted. Ethan nodded. That happens when every outcome becomes a measurement. Charlotte laughed softly. You make everything sound simple. It usually is simple. Ethan shrugged. Simple does not mean easy. The word stayed with her throughout the afternoon. Before leaving, Ethan asked one more favor. Come by the house tomorrow. Charlotte looked surprised. Why? Caleb has a science project. She blinked, and Ethan smiled. He needs another set of hands. The following afternoon, Charlotte arrived at Ethan's modest home, carrying far more nervousness than she expected. Inside, the kitchen table was covered with wires, cardboard, and notebooks. Utility bills remained tucked beneath magnets on the refrigerator. Caleb immediately handed her a roll of tape. Perfect timing. For the next 2 hours, they worked together, building a weather monitoring display. Nobody mentioned therapy. Nobody discussed medical records. Nobody talked about recovery. They simply shared an ordinary afternoon. As the project took shape, Charlotte found herself laughing more than she had in months. Ethan noticed. So did Caleb. Yet later, as Charlotte prepared to leave, she paused near the front porch steps. Her eyes drifted downward. The simple wooden steps looked insignificant. 3 short steps leading to the driveway. She stared at them for several seconds before looking away. Ethan noticed the expression immediately. Something had changed. For the first time in years, Charlotte was no longer asking whether recovery was possible. She was beginning to wonder whether she had stopped herself from trying. And that realization was both hopeful and terrifying. For the first time in years, Charlotte left Ethan's house thinking about possibility instead of limitation. The feeling should have been encouraging. Instead, it frightened her. Hope always carried risk. Over the next 2 weeks, she found herself returning to small habits she had abandoned long ago. Not because anyone ordered her to, because she wanted to. The notebook Ethan had discovered in her therapy room returned to her bedside table. She began writing again. Each morning she recorded one thing she attempted instead of one thing she avoided. Some entries seemed almost insignificant. Spending extra time standing during a transfer. Participating in a rehabilitation exercise she previously skipped. Visiting the community rehabilitation center without being prompted. Yet each action represented something larger. She was no longer measuring success only by whether she could walk. She was measuring it by whether she was still willing to try. Meanwhile, life continued normally for Ethan. He drove Caleb to school each morning in the aging pickup truck before heading to work. Utility bills still arrived. Groceries still needed buying. Repairs still needed completing. Nothing about his circumstances had suddenly become easier. Yet Charlotte noticed something important. Ethan never spoke about sacrifice as though it made him special. He simply carried responsibility because it belonged to him. One afternoon, Charlotte visited a school science showcase where Caleb presented the weather monitoring project they had built together. The school hallway buzzed with students and parents moving between displays. Caleb proudly explained data charts while Charlotte listened. Watching him reminded her of something she had lost years ago. Not mobility, joy. Ethan stood nearby, speaking with another parent. When Charlotte rolled beside him, she smiled. You know something? Ethan looked over. What? She glanced toward Caleb. Your son believes every problem can be solved. Ethan laughed softly. That is because he has not paid a mortgage yet. Charlotte laughed harder than she expected. The sound surprised both of them. But progress rarely moves in a straight line. 3 days later, Charlotte attended a private meeting with her executive team. During a break, one senior advisor questioned the time she had been spending away from work. People are noticing changes, he said carefully. Some investors are concerned you seem distracted. Charlotte stared at him for several seconds. 20 years earlier, the comment would have immediately altered her priorities. This time it did not. Yet the conversation reopened an old fear. What if she was chasing false hope? What if she disappointed everyone again? That evening she drove home, carrying doubts she thought she had left behind. Later, she called Ethan. He answered while sorting tools in his garage. Bad day, he asked after hearing her voice. Charlotte sighed. How do you know? Because good days do not usually start with silence. For nearly an hour they talked. Not about therapy, not about medicine, about fear, expectations, the pressure of carrying other people's opinions. By the end of the conversation, Charlotte felt calmer. But the next morning brought something neither of them expected. During a routine session at the rehabilitation center, a therapist encouraged Charlotte to attempt a movement she had not tried in years. The effort lasted only seconds. Yet afterward, she experienced severe pain and overwhelming exhaustion. Old fears immediately resurfaced. Memories of failed treatments, failed promises, failed hope. By evening, she refused to continue. She canceled the next appointment. She ignored calls from the center. And when Ethan arrived at her house the following day, he found the therapy room locked once again. The notebook sat unopened on a nearby table. For the first time since their journey began, it looked as though Charlotte might be retreating back into the life she had spent 20 years building around disappointment. The locked therapy room remained closed for 3 days. 3 long days in which Charlotte ignored messages, canceled appointments, and convinced herself that nothing had truly changed. The old patterns returned quickly. Work meetings filled every hour. Executives praised her focus. Advisors congratulated her for getting back to business. From the outside, her life looked exactly as successful as before. Inside, it felt painfully familiar. Ethan never pressured her. He never lectured. He simply sent one short message each morning. "Hope you're doing okay." That was all. No advice. No guilt. No expectations. On the 4th day, Charlotte finally replied with a single sentence. "I think I was foolish to believe anything could be different." Ethan read the message while sitting in his pickup truck outside a hardware store after work. He stared at the screen for several moments before putting the phone away. Sometimes the kindest response was patience. That evening, rain drifted across Wichita once again. Charlotte sat alone in her office overlooking the city skyline. The notebook remained unopened on her desk. Beyond the glass, thousands of lights illuminated streets filled with people moving through ordinary lives. Grocery stores closed for the night. Families gathered around dinner tables. Teenagers finished homework. The world continued moving forward. She felt strangely left behind. Then her phone rang. It was not Ethan. It was the rehabilitation center. One of the patients she had met during her visit wanted to speak with her. Reluctantly, she accepted the call. The young woman recovering from a serious injury sounded cheerful despite obvious challenges. "We missed you today," she said. Charlotte closed her eyes. "I'm not sure I'm coming back." Silence followed. Then the young woman laughed softly. "You know what is funny?" Charlotte frowned. "What?" "When you visited us, you told me not to let one bad day decide my future." The words hit with uncomfortable force. Charlotte remembered saying them. She had meant every word. Somehow applying them to herself felt much harder. After the call ended, she remained motionless for a long time. Across town, Ethan sat at his kitchen table helping Caleb study for an exam. Utility bills remained stacked beside the refrigerator. Life was still complicated, still uncertain, yet there was a quiet steadiness in the house. Caleb looked up from his textbook. "Have you heard from her?" Ethan nodded. "A little." The boy studied his father. "You're worried." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe." Caleb considered this. "You always tell me that people need time to figure things out themselves." Ethan laughed softly. "I really do say that, do not I?" Yet beneath the humor, concern remained. The next morning brought another setback. Charlotte attended a board meeting where investors openly questioned recent decisions that had shifted her attention away from expansion projects. The criticism was professional, respectful, but relentless. By the time the meeting ended, every doubt she carried had been reinforced. Driving home, she passed the community rehabilitation center without stopping. Then she passed the diner where she first met Ethan. Then she passed the church parking lot where volunteers distributed food boxes to families. Everywhere she looked, she saw reminders of people continuing despite difficulty. Still, she drove on. When she finally arrived home, she found something unexpected waiting beside her mailbox. An old notebook. Her notebook. Ethan had dropped it off earlier that afternoon. Tucked inside was a folded piece of paper. No speech. No instructions. Just a copy of one journal entry she had written 15 years earlier. The page described a younger Charlotte promising herself she would never stop trying, no matter how long recovery took. At the bottom, Ethan had written a single sentence in his careful handwriting. "You were stronger before you became afraid." Charlotte sat in her wheelchair, staring at those words as tears filled her eyes. For the first time since the setback, she opened the notebook again. And what she discovered on the very next page would force her to confront a truth she had spent 20 years trying not to see. Charlotte sat beside her mailbox long after the sun had disappeared. The notebook rested open in her lap. The page Ethan had unknowingly led her back to was dated 17 years earlier. She read the words 3 times before the truth fully settled in. It was not a medical breakthrough, not a hidden diagnosis. It was something far more personal. The entry described the moment she stopped measuring progress by effort and started measuring it only by results. The day she decided that if she could not walk again, Trying itself had no value. Over the years, that belief had quietly become part of her identity. Doctors had treated her body. Therapists had treated her muscles. But nobody had challenged the story she had been telling herself for nearly 2 decades. Tears slipped down her face as she closed the notebook. For the first time, she understood what Ethan had seen. The greatest barrier in her life was no longer the injury alone. It was the fear of failing in front of people who expected success from her in everything. The next morning, Charlotte drove herself to the community rehabilitation center. No press, no assistance, no announcement, just a woman returning because she was finally ready to try again. The therapists were surprised to see her. More surprised when she asked to begin with the simplest exercises. Not the advanced equipment, not ambitious goals, just the basics. The work was frustrating, humbling, slow, yet something had changed. She was no longer chasing a miracle. She was rebuilding trust. Weeks passed, then months. Ethan never became her coach, never pretended to be a medical expert. Instead, he remained exactly who he had always been. A father, a friend, a man who showed up. Some afternoons he met her after work for coffee at the same diner where they first sat together. Other days, she joined Ethan and Caleb for ordinary dinners in their modest home. Utility bills still sat beneath refrigerator magnets. Caleb still filled the kitchen with science projects. Life remained beautifully normal. And in that normalcy, Charlotte found healing she had not realized she needed. One crisp autumn afternoon, the rehabilitation center hosted a community event to celebrate patient milestones. Families gathered beneath colorful banners. Volunteers served food from folding tables near a church parking lot. Laughter drifted through the air. Ethan arrived directly from work, dust still clinging to his boots. He expected to spend the afternoon cheering for other people. Instead, Charlotte asked him to meet her near the therapy room. "There is something I want you to see," she said quietly. Ethan followed without asking questions. Inside, therapists stood nearby, smiling nervously. Charlotte's wheelchair rested several feet away. Ethan immediately understood. "Charlotte," she took a slow breath. "Do not make this bigger than it is." His eyes softened. "Okay." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Charlotte placed both hands on parallel support bars and carefully shifted her weight. The room fell silent. Not because anyone expected perfection, because everyone understood what courage looked like. One step would not erase 20 years. One step would not solve everything. But one step could change what someone believed was possible. Slowly, with effort and concentration, Charlotte moved forward. Then again, then once more. Only a few feet. Yet they were feet she once believed she would never travel. Tears appeared throughout the room. Ethan did not rush toward her. He did not celebrate prematurely. He simply stood there with the same quiet dignity he had carried from the beginning. When Charlotte finally looked up, she saw pride in his eyes. Not pride in himself. Pride in her. That realization meant more than the steps. Later that afternoon, Charlotte stood before patients, families, therapists, and community members. The wheelchair remained beside her. The parallel bars remained nearby. She made no attempt to exaggerate what had happened. "Today is not the story," she said. "The story is that I finally stopped being afraid to try." Her gaze found Ethan in the crowd. "For 20 years, people offer me treatments. One man offered me respect." The room grew still. He never treated me like a diagnosis. He never treated me like a billionaire. He treated me like a human being worth believing in. Ethan lowered his eyes, uncomfortable with attention as always. But the applause that followed was not for fame. It was for character. In the months that followed, Charlotte continued improving. Some days were good. Others were difficult. Yet she no longer measured life by what she could not do. Ethan's life remained simple. The pickup truck still rattled down Kansas roads. Caleb still needed rides to school. Bills still arrived in the mailbox. But something meaningful had changed. A friendship built on dignity, respect, and second chances had transformed 2 lives. One evening, as the sun set behind the neighborhood, Charlotte sat on Ethan's front porch while Caleb excitedly described a new science project. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass. Porch lights flickered on across the street. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Charlotte smiled. You know what is funny? Ethan looked over. What? She laughed softly. After 20 years, the thing that changed my life was not a miracle. Ethan smiled. What was it? Charlotte glanced toward the yard where ordinary life unfolded in front of them. Someone who never stopped seeing the person before the problem. The silence that followed felt warm, peaceful, earned. And as evening settled over the small Kansas neighborhood, the greatest victory was not that Charlotte had taken steps again. It was that both of them had discovered something even more valuable. Dignity creates healing. Kindness creates courage. And sometimes a second chance begins the moment someone believes you are still worth trying for.